Thank you all very much indeed for joining us today. I'm Sarah Gordon. I'm the Chief Executive of the Impact Investing Institute in the UK, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion on Green Plus bonds delivering climate action with social renewal. And we're incredibly pleased to be co-hosting this discussion today with the Social Impact Agenda per l'Italia. And this is part of the pre-COP proceedings, the COP26, which will be in November, which is led by the All for Climate 2021 Italy programme. Just to give you a very quick introduction to our work at the Impact Investing Institute in the UK, we were launched in 2019 with a focus on accelerating the growth and improving the effectiveness of the impact investing market in the UK and globally. And I joined the Institute in 2019 as its first chief executive. And before that, I'd spent 18 years as a business journalist at the Financial Times, where I ran the paper's corporate coverage during the financial crisis. And of course, we then thought that would be the big event of the early 21st century, but unfortunately, that's not been the case with the last year and a half that we've all experienced. We have a vision at the Impact Investing Institute, which is for lives to improve as more people choose to use their savings and investments to help solve social and environmental challenges at the same time as seeking a financial return. And our work is really devoted to enabling and facilitating more private sector capital to contribute to the well-being of people and the planet within the framework of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we're an independent organisation, we're not for profit, and we were brought together as part of two influential initiatives. And one of those was that we are the UK's National Advisory Board on Impact Investing. And Filippo Montesi, who's joining us for our panel discussion, leads our Italian equivalent, the Italian National Advisory Board on Impact Investing. And as national advisory boards, we're both part of the global steering group for impact investment. And one of the reasons for sharing that with you is that there's this incredibly exciting initiative going on at the moment, which we can talk about a bit more later, which is that with the global steering group for impact investment, we're co-leading a G7 impact task force, which is under the UK's presidency of the G7 this year. And the task force is focusing its work on impact transparency and accountability. And the work that we're leading within it is focusing on impact financing vehicles and policy. And within that work, we have a particular focus on the just transition and on this concept of green plus, that environmental finance and environmental outcomes must always take into consideration people, communities, and the social outcomes of green finance. And I think that the pandemic and indeed the climate crisis, the twin urgencies of these two huge challenges to us as a planet, have really increased the focus on how private capital, but also sovereign and sovereign bonds, government bonds as well, can really deliver and support those economic, social and environmental policy goals. And I mean, one of the things that's been really exciting at the Institute over what has been quite a roller coaster 2 years since we were launched is really seeing the massive momentum in the market, and particularly in the bond market, behind green and sustainable financing. And obviously, green bonds are the most established instruments to address sustainability challenges, which they obviously allocate proceeds to environmental projects. But I think the market has exploded really, and there are more recent innovations, including social bonds, sustainability bonds, with the former focused on social outcomes and the latter allocating proceeds to a combination of both social and environmental. And really this growth and momentum in the market has to be hugely welcomed. It's a sign of both the appetite of not just the huge need to address these challenges, but also the appetite among investors, among individual people, among governments, policymakers to deliver these social and environmental goals, and to think about pushing the envelope really in financial markets of the financing vehicles that can work to those ends. And obviously, all these bonds, they've grown rapidly in response to the pandemic and indeed to investor demand. So social bond supply has gone up from just 14 billion in 2019 to 117 billion in 2020. And the green bond market was at 212 billion euros issuance in 2019 and still reached a record 223 billion euros in 2020. And what there is really, because of the relative maturity of that green bond market, there is a really increasingly broad and deep pool of what you might call green investment capital. And historically, to appeal to those green investors, those managers and owners of that green investment capital, bonds, whether sovereign or corporate, would require strict environmental use of proceeds, and investors were somewhat more wary of less well-defined social outcomes. And I think that one of the really interesting developments in the market has been, and I think it's partly due to the pandemic and the pressures that the pandemic has put on our social structures, that traditionally green, what you might call green only investors, are really increasingly recognizing the importance of investments that support environmental outcomes that have demonstrable positive social impact. And in the UK, we last year, in response to this shift, and also because at the Impact Investing Institute, that concept of the green plus, the just transition, the idea that the transition to net zero must be socially inclusive for it to work, for it to be accepted, for it to be the kind of transition that will deliver a world that we want future generations to live in. We worked last year very closely with the London School of Economics and the Green Finance Institute in the UK to advocate with the UK government that it should introduce what we were calling a green plus gilt, so a green plus sovereign bond, which would finance green spending, but also deliver alongside that green spending social co-benefits. And that's really to deliver that outcome, that just transition that takes into account people and places. And our engagement was, I mean, we were met really with open ears, and I think we'll hear more about that from participants in our panel discussion. But it was an incredibly constructive engagement with the UK government, who this time last year committed to issue green bonds, green gilts, and also to report on their social co-benefits critically. And obviously earlier this week, we had the UK's inaugural last week, so all time flies, the UK issued its inaugural green gilt, which was for £10 billion. And this green gilt was 10 times oversubscribed. So there was £100 billion worth of bids on the initial 10 billion sale. And I think that's a fantastic testament both to the UK government's willingness to do something which is pushing the market forward in terms of reporting on social co-benefits, but also that there is such significant investor appetite for green gilts and green plus sovereign and corporate bonds. And this is not unique to the UK. I mean, other countries are also beginning to develop approaches to sovereign green bonds, which combine that social and environmental spending. And earlier this year, Italy also launched its first sovereign green bond, BTP Green, and that seeks to contribute both to the environmental objectives of the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, but also to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a very successful issue, raising 8.5 billion euros. And we're very glad to have Davide Yacovoni who was very much part of that whole process to talk about it. And that was so Italy had the biggest ever debut sovereign green bond by an EU issuer, and the UK, sadly, and I'll put my cards on the table here, sadly no longer a member of the EU, but had the largest debut green bond ever. So you can see this momentum really building. So I think it's, you know, ahead of COP26, it's important that we celebrate progress, but I think it's also really important for us to explore some of the challenges faced both by bond issuers, by investors and other stakeholders in delivering truly a green plus approach, and how to, you know, looking at the challenges of how we really ensure a fully just transition to net zero. And we're really delighted, therefore, to be joined today by some fantastic voices on our panel, people that we've been working with in a number of different ways over the last few years, and really glad to have them providing their views in our discussion today. Before I get to their introductions, I just have a few bits of information for our audience. Firstly, as you'll see in the top left-hand corner, the event is being recorded. It will be available for you to watch after the event. We'll send it to you, send it around to you in a short follow-up email, which will also summarize the key takeaways from today's session. So please do look out for that, and please do share it with your colleagues and interested people. We're very much about spreading the word on this. We definitely don't have all the answers, but we think what we do know is that it is only through collaboration that we will deliver the outcomes that we seek to. So please do share the information onwards. We'll have plenty of time to take audience questions during the event. And please, could I ask you to post your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the discussion, and you'll also have the chance to upvote questions in that Q&A function. So please do use that feature to show us which questions are most important to you. So I will like now to invite the panelists to join me on screen as I introduce them. I've rather unfairly asked them to do this a bit earlier than they were expecting. So if I can just, thank you very much indeed. Let me start with Arunma. Arunma Oteh is an academic scholar at the University of Oxford. She's also on the Global Leadership Council at Said Business School there. And her research areas of focus are capital markets, economic development, and financial technology. And that research stems from a long career in a number of acting in a number of incredibly influential positions on this topic. She's the former vice president and treasurer of the World Bank. We're also incredibly pleased that Arunma is a member of our G7 Impact Task Force that I spoke about earlier, that the Institute is co-leading with the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment. She was named one of Africa's 50 most influential African women by Forbes Africa in March 2020, and one of Panelists' 2020 top 100 people of Black heritage in the UK. We're incredibly pleased to have her involved in lots of areas of our work, but particularly welcome her here today. To turn to our second panelist, Filippo Montesi. Filippo, as I said, runs what is Italy's National Advisory Board on Impact Investment, and is our sister organisation in Italy. And it's been a great pleasure working with him over the last 2 years on our shared agenda and shared goals. Filippo is one of only 8 people in Europe who is accredited to provide training on social return on investment, which is a really interesting concept. If you're not familiar with it, Filippo, I must give you a chance to talk a bit about it, because it's so relevant for the topics that we're talking about today. And Filippo has worked with a number of international organisations. They include UNCTAD, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNDP, and he's worked on the design, management and evaluation of projects across Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean. And he's currently a senior advisor at Human Foundation. He provides support to a wide range of financial institutions and social enterprises in managing their impact. And last, but definitely from our perspective, not least, he's Secretary General of Social Impact Agenda per l'Italia, the Italian National Advisory Board for Impact Investing. Welcome, Filippo. Turning now to Nick Robbins. Nick is Professor in Practice for Finance at the London School of Economics Grantham Research Institute. He joined there in February 2018. Before that, he has a long career in financial services and elsewhere. So he brings that professor in practice. He's always at pains to make this clear. It is academic work that is very, very grounded in the real life challenges and opportunities of the financial services industry. And he focuses on how to mobilize finance for climate action, but in ways that support a just transition. So particularly promoting the role of central banks and regulators in achieving sustainable development and investigating how the financial system can support the restoration of nature. And as I said earlier, Nick and the Impact Investing Institute have now been working very closely together for over a year, and particularly on our engagement with the UK government. So it's a great pleasure to have such a close colleague and friend with us here today. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Davide Yacovoni. Davide, as I said earlier, has been very, very closely involved in the Italian government's efforts and enormous progress in the field of green and sustainable finance. He's the head of the directorate responsible for the management of public debt securities at the Department of the Treasury within the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. And that directorate covers all the activities related to public debt management. And before that, he spent 13 years as the head of the domestic funding division in charge of the front and middle office of all euro-denominated Italian government bonds within the same directorate. And as well as that, he was also the head of the division in charge of relations with the OECD and the coverage of emerging markets assistance programs on public debt management issues. So he brings both that domestic issuance perspective, but also that emerging market and OECD perspective, which is incredibly important for our discussion. And unsurprisingly, Davide is also has teaching responsibilities. He teaches public debt management at the University of Padua and has published on public debt and finance, both from a macro and micro perspective. So incredibly pleased to have Davide with us here today. And as you can see, our audience can see that we've got this range of voices to explore this really important subject together today. So incredibly glad that that is the case. I think I will kick off first of all with Filippo, as you are co-hosting the event with us today. And really looking at this whole concept of green plus, of green with social co-benefits, and asking how corporate issuers in Italy have engaged with that concept, and where you see sort of Italian corporate issuance going with the green plus approach. Because I think one of the really important things that we all recognize is the catalytic effect of government issuing and more government issuers leading the way on this. So talk to us a bit about how that's influenced the corporate market in Italy.
Sure. Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to co-organize these interesting webinar. So from an Italian perspective, or at least in my experience, green bonds and social bonds are growing significantly. In the last 2 years, we had a growth of about 90%, which is a quite significant figure, mainly driven by green bonds and less by social bonds. And in my view, in my work, I had seen corporate issuers that tend to address sustainability challenges in a fragmented way, often detaching environmental issues from social ones. And I think this type of approach can bring a risk for sustainability because the two dimensions are deeply intertwined and shouldn't be addressed as a trade-off, but should be addressed as in synergy. And we can see this tendency also in our public debate, where often social issues such as access to energy, employment, land management are depicted in opposition to environmental objectives, and vice versa. So environmental issues that are used in contraposition against social issues. And I believe this approach is really hampering the opportunities that, for example, social innovation can have for the environment. It's reducing the opportunities that we can exploit through these instruments in order to deliver a greater value, a greater social, environmental, and economic value. I also see more in general a tendency of having a compliance mindset rather than a strategic view on environmental and social impact. And if we applied, for example, impact measurement to bonds, we would be in a much better position in order to identify and also manage the intended and unintended consequences of our financial activities. And we would be better able to manage environmental outcomes together with social outcomes. So there are some questions that we should perhaps try to answer about what is the impact strategy of an issuer, what are the targets that we are identifying and managing, what are the environmental and social outcomes that we want to produce and how much change we want to create, and also addressing the negative consequences of our actions. So, I mean, I think I think these questions really matter if we are serious with contributing to SDGs. So I think there's much potential that has still to be tapped on.
Thank you very much, Felipe. And I think that's an incredibly good starting point that address that challenge that environmental and social, there's not a trade-off, there's a synergy between environmental and social, and also thinking about issuers being more conscious and accountable for the impact of their green spending and their social spending. I mean, Davide, can I turn to you now? Obviously, I spoke in my opening remarks about the fact that the Italian government has, it's really shown the way on thinking through how sovereign green bonds can contribute not just to environmental objectives, but to the broader United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd really be interested for you to talk through with us the thinking behind that, and also where you see that going, how you see that sovereignty and that focus of the Italian government on financing for the SDGs, how you see that developing. And Davide,
thank you very
mute.
much for having invited me in such a distinguished conference. Yeah, I mean, I will try to explain a little bit the rationale behind our choice, and then try to address a little bit the issues we raised in the end of your set of questions. So the analysis of the green bond market and the chance for Italy, for the Republic of Italy as a government to start issuing green government bonds actually started quite a while ago, especially after some large sovereign issuers in Europe had started entering into this market, referring specifically to France, that started issuing these green Oteh in 2017. And since then, we have opened a very intense dialogue with some of the main among our primary dealers on more general issue related to green finance, to what are the investors operating there, what kind of logic, and try to understand a little bit better this kind of a market. We were actually impressed by the growth of this market that you mentioned also in your introduction since 2017 in terms of amount of bonds, the number of investors that are involved, the increasing share of asset under management of tailored and specialized funds. And so due to that, we start, mulling over all potential benefit from a pure debt management perspective about this idea of issuing these bonds. But of course, then we were in a condition also to alert our political level of the relevance, of potential relevance of such an idea, even from a pure political perspective. So we saw all the benefits from our job, from our public debt management perspective, but we if you figure out what could be the potential for also, a political approach to this idea of issuing green bonds as a sovereigns. Then we have in 2019, as you know, the Green New Deal launched by the new commission, and the Italian government followed pretty soon after that with its own national Green New Deal. Most of it was actually translated into a series of legal provisions in the budget for 2020 that were approved at the end of 2019. And in that budget, we finally found the decision of the government, which was to finance some of these new Green New Deal expenses with green bonds. So this was, for the first time, this was actually stated in the budget law of the government. The same law also allowed the Ministry of the Economy and Finance, who is in charge of debt management, to set up an interministerial committee, so to put together, from an institutional perspective, all the ministries that are responsible for potential green eligible expenditures in order to collect as much information as possible. And then the Ministry of Economy and Finance was also in charge of issuing ad hoc decrees in order to rule the contents and the form of information regarding the green eligible expenditures then has to be collected from the other ministries. So in the end, politics completely embraced the sovereign green bond project. And so if you ask me, so what was the approach and what was the goal for us to go in that domain of green bonds? I would say in the end, it was twofold. So on one side, the idea was to bring more transparency and commitment for the government to use the public budget for finance environmental sustainability, and in this way to provide investors, to provide analysts and observers a clear and more, if you want, aggregate picture of the financial magnitude of these policies, of their realization and of their impact. Something that you don't find easily on an aggregated basis. You may find information of single type of expenditure, single project, but difficultly you find something that gives you a whole picture of what the government is doing in that domain. Of course, we know that the green eligible expenditures are used to be covered by green bonds. That's just a subset of the total public expenditure in these fields. But nonetheless, it provides an in-depth information on a significant sample of them. So that was very important. So to provide the commitment of the government on this kind of policy. And so having bonds that finance these allow you to get this transparency and this commitment. But on the other side, it will bring very large benefits also from a pure debt management perspective, because it's a way to diversify the supply of financial securities in the market from our side. And so it's a way to catch new investors, which has a totally different approach, or somehow a different approach to ordinary investors when it comes to financial investment. And diversify the base of investors is always crucial for a large issuer like Italy is. And especially this became even more important during the pandemic, where, the needs for the government of funding increased massively. And so having another tool to, finance itself was extremely important. I'll try to conclude by saying, so then we, after all that, it took quite a while to set up all the, say, institutional setting to be ready to issue, but we published these sovereign green bond framework in February 2021. And then, as you mentioned correctly, we had the first issuance in March. It was quite a big success. So now our bond, which are called BTPs, the BTP Green is now, for example, included in the MSCI index or in the climate bonds green bond database. So it's a well-recognized instruments for in the community of ESG investors. What we're going to do in terms of objectives that we want to achieve by funding these, by using, sorry, these green bonds. Well, of course, we are looking at the 6 environmental objectives of the EU Sustainable Finances Taxonomy regarding climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, the transition to the circular economy, the pollution prevention and control, and the protection and restoration of biodiversity. So these are well-known 6 goals, and several of the expenditures that we're going to cover with these bonds will allow it contribute to achieve these objectives. Nonetheless, there are specific UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, that these expenditures will also contribute. We're talking about the goal number 6 on clear water and sanitation, the goal number 7 on affordable and clean energy, the goal number 11 of sustainable cities and communities, the goal 12 on responsible consumption and production, the goal 13 on climate action, the goal 14 on life below water, and the goal 15 on life on land. So here we had to categorize all our expenditures in 6 main areas regarding the cost efficiency in energy production, the new renewable energy, the circular economy, the research activity that is carried out to improve sustainability in technologies, and we end up also regarding the protection of the environment. So these are all areas, categories, sorry, with which we are, say, fragmenting our total public expenditure, our green eligible expenditures. For the future, and I'll stop here, of course, this is not just one-shot initiative. So we are really, pushing for a program. So we will have several bonds over the future in order to finance these expenditures. And of course, we are committed to provide all the information regarding how much these expenditures are actually realized, they actually took place, and what is the environmental impact on that. Indeed, we will be following the so-called ICMA principles, and going forward, to answer your question, we'll try to more and more to adhere to the EU green bond principles. As you know, the Commission has just proposed a regulation regarding these principles. And over time, of course, we'll try to adapt as much as possible in order then to be compliant with these principles and to being able to issue EU green bond labeled securities.
Davide, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think it's very helpful for the audience to understand that the hurdles of doing a green bond for the first time at the sovereign level are really, it requires an enormous amount of engagement and a different approach and a different way of thinking about a number of elements of public debt management, particularly around use of proceeds, as you've so eloquently described. And I think that one of the things that got the UK government really over its hesitations was the evidence from countries like Italy and indeed Poland and others that have issued a green bond that, as you say, it attracts a different investor pool, a different type of investor. And I think in Poland, the sovereign bond, their green sovereign bond, I think 2/3 of the investors in that issue were investors who had never before invested in a Polish sovereign instrument. So I think it's a really powerful argument with governments. And Arunma, can I turn to you next, because I think that that issue of the sort of future potential of these bonds, and not just the green bonds, but really focusing on that green plus social, that environmental spending, which is also taking into account people, communities, and the positive and negative impacts on that. I mean, I feel quite excited about this as something that is really going to liberate capital flows for environmental and social outcomes in the EU, in Europe, and in countries like Italy and the UK, but also globally, into emerging markets, but also elsewhere. And I'd really love your views on whether you share that sense of potential and how you see that market developing. Arunma, you're on mute.
It's probably the most popular phrase since the pandemic. First of all, Sarah, I want to say thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this important event that you and Filippo have sponsored. But I can't help but say you have had enormous impact in 2 years. I mean, it's phenomenal. I have to remind myself that the Impact Investment Institute has only been around for 2 years. Seeing your contribution to supporting the UK government to launch what, in my view, is a phenomenal transaction is also something that I'd like to just say openly and give you credit for. That transaction shares some of what the World Bank, being one of the pioneers of the green bond market, has always suggested that communication with your investors brings credibility. And I think Davide also talked about that. The first green label transaction ever, which was launched by the World Bank in 2008, it was because Nordic investors were looking to take climate risk, but to understand how the nature of that risk that they were taking. And for me, when I think back to a $290 million transaction focused on the Nordics and where we are, I think we've done very well. And the future is bright, whether globally or for developing countries, which you've asked me to touch on. And the reason the future is bright is really because I do think that green finance and sustainable finance more generally has very unique attributes. One, investors can feel that they can monitor the use of their proceeds. Those impact reports are extremely important. The screening of projects so that I know that it's a kind of project that I want to invest in. Getting an independent party, so whether a second party opinion or a third party verification, adds credibility. So for me, it's a very attractive form of financing. And the needs are huge. One of my concerns is that despite how attractive the global green bonds are and sustainable finance more generally, that they still make up a very small portion of a $100 trillion bond market. So for emerging markets, of the total, 20% of the market is emerging market issuers. But if you strip out China, it's 8%. So there is huge opportunity for investors who are thinking about green. And the World Bank and other MDBs have supported a number of the countries in developing the taxonomy, the framework, and in providing other services. But I will just step back, Sarah, and say that the needs of financing are huge. And without financing, all of what we're saying about getting to below 1.5 degrees centigrade, we will not get there. A report I had read last year said, if you take the energy sector, the annual funding last year had gotten to about $300 billion for clean and renewables. But if we want to get to where we want to get to in terms of clean energy, we'll need about $2.5 trillion to be able to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The annual gap for infrastructure investing for developing countries, the UN estimates about $1.5 trillion. It's between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion. And all of you know that infrastructure is transformational, whether it's what you do with transport, roads, ports, and whatever. The IFC estimates that even just more broadly, that investment opportunities into emerging markets have the potential to generate another $10 trillion from now till 2030 and create around 200 million jobs. And I remember Filippo's in his remarks, his point around just the focus on co-benefits. I mean, green is not just green, it's people who benefit when there's less pollution. It's people who benefit when there are fewer extreme weather events. It's people who benefit when we create jobs as a result of what we're doing to build infrastructure. Pre-pandemic, the annual financing gap for sustainable development goals for developing countries was about, as estimated by Oteh, was about $2.5 trillion. And globally, it's at least $5 trillion. So the 2 points I'm making is this is an attractive way for investors to think about investing in green in any part of the world. And for developing countries, it's a way that gives comfort to investors. So they've got the opportunity to showcase the nature of what they'll be investing in. And then two, we have an urgency, we have an emergency, we have huge financing needs. And for the developing world, even more so. So if we can, as Davide mentioned, bring in other investors that would not normally have thought about this space, then it's a real opportunity. It's additive. So let me pause there, but those were my two key messages in response to your question.
Thank you very much indeed, Arunma, and also thank you for your initial comments. Nick, this issue that Arunma's highlighted, communicating with investors brings credibility, but also the opportunities that this approach, this green plus just transition approach, provides for investors, but also combining, that's the opportunity, but the gap is so huge, the need is so great, the financing need is so great. What I'd like you to share with us is, from the engagement that we, you and I, and the Green Finance Institute had with the UK government on this topic, what lessons are there? What are replicable things from that process that can help speed up that global just transition financing that, as Arunma has said, is A, so huge, and B, so urgently needed?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and it's great to be virtually in Italy once again. Sadly, not in person, but hopefully very soon. And really, I'd like to pick sort of start where Arunma left off, and I think Filippo and Davide both highlighted this. Is I think sometimes in our minds when we think about sustainable finance, we think of ESG as three separate pillars, but I think as we've heard, green investments, which are so essential in the recovery after COVID, actually have a lot of, in a sense, sometimes invisible social co-benefits. So one, we could reveal those social co-benefits, the jobs that are created, the quality of those jobs, the communities that benefit. And also we could shape the allocation of the green expenditures, and really good to hear from Davide about the leadership Italy has showed it. We could shape the allocation of that green spending to actually create social co-benefits, particularly in places of our countries which need it, places perhaps with high unemployment, places that are going to be impacted as we move away from fossil fuel, coal regions, oil and gas regions, and so on and so forth. So I think the main lesson that actually came out of the design of the Green Plus proposal, which is literally a year ago this month, was the recognition from the market that they actually wanted instruments that combined the E and the S. Clearly, we have green bonds, we have social bonds, we have sustainability bonds, transition bonds now. But I think a sort of a more mature model, which did explicit connect the green and the social, was a demand, and in the process of from the market, and in the process of designing the Green Plus proposal with yourselves at the Impact Investing Institute and the Grantham, the Green Finance Institute, we actually got backing from about 10 trillion of investors who actually said this is a model that we really like to see. So I think that's principle number one, that sort of sense of a combined holistic approach. I think then actually the dialogue with debt management offices, with treasuries, with the market was very key to actually provide evidence from the market in terms of actually how design can deliver those core DMO objectives in terms of efficient raising of capital at low cost for the state, diversifying the base. And I think therefore obviously a very close dialogue with the government. What was interesting to see in this process was the design of the Green Plus proposal, where we indicated how you could identify the social co-benefits of green spending from a green sovereign bond. The release of that proposal, talking with the government beforehand. A month later, the finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, announced that a green sovereign bond would be issued, and that was great to see so soon afterwards. And then this year, the government released its green bond, green financing framework, like Italy did in February this year. In June this year, we had that, and we were very pleased, I think, as a consortium of institutes, to see the classic green sectors that are laid out in terms of clean transport, adaptation, energy efficiency, renewables, nature, and so on, but also a strong commitment to report on those social co-benefits. And that was, I think, a world first, and it was very good to see that. And as you've highlighted, Sarah, we've now seen the first issuance under that framework, £10 billion, about 11 billion euros, with that commitment to report on the social co-benefits, and a small greenium in terms of improved pricing for the UK state in that. So I think this shows that actually connecting the issuance of the green sovereign bond to the political priorities of the government, clearly recovering from COVID, leading with the green economy, creating jobs, and in the UK context, the sort of levelling up the economy. That's number one. Very clearly talking to the market, understanding their demands. Investors want to see instruments which connect the green and the social, and then actually thinking very practically about the measurement of these benefits, and thinking forward more. So thinking not just, for example, about the jobs that are created through green spending, the quality of those jobs, and also something probably shared by both countries is really thinking about the regional allocation of some of those spending priorities, which is also, I think, a priority going forward.
Thank you very much, Nick. And one of the things that the Grantham Research Institute and my institute, the Impact Investing Institute, have worked on since the government's announcement of the UK government's announcement of a green bond is really trying to think through what practical tools and ways of linking the social co-benefits with the environmental use of proceeds. And I would direct you to our website, impactinvest.org.uk, where we have a publication which explicitly lays out a framework for linking social co-benefits to environmental use of proceeds. And because part of this, Filippo, is about helping both issuers, whether corporate or sovereign, but also investors, understand what this actually looks like in practice. You know, we are now seeing increasing evidence that this can be done, this Green Plus approach can be taken, that there is enormous investor appetite for it, that there is enormous potential, as Arunma has laid out, for the market globally. I mean, just within the EU, I mean, how do you see that Green Plus approach being further developed and adopted? Do you see challenges? Do you see opportunities?
Well, I think such an approach, the Green Plus approach, must gain traction in the EU if we want to contribute to a just transition. And I see quite many opportunities along with some challenges. And these opportunities, I think, come from the EU. So on the one hand, we have the Next Generation EU, which will provide, which could provide significant and additional resources. And much of the funding will be done through green bonds. So this is a great opportunity. And then we also have the social taxonomy, more in general, I mean, the EU taxonomy that will provide, I believe, a more complete framework that will integrate environmental and social factors together. The challenges, I think, relates with the national recovery and resilience plans. So I think the role of public policy will be really important, will be crucial. And I try to explain myself because it's the national plans that will define how green and social expenditures will be made. So if we don't have plans that recognize the importance of this connection, this combination of environmental issues and social issues, the instruments, the bonds, will not be able to deliver positive environmental impact along with social co-benefits. So it's really crucial in this very moment that the governments, the national governments with the EU, with the European Commission, will define national plans that identify objectives and indicators. And then the other challenge, which is global, I think, is the impact washing. I mean, everybody is speaking about impact washing, and I think it's a real threat for the credibility of this asset class. So it's very important to work with all stakeholder groups in order to have evidence, guidelines, case studies, in order to understand how we can really design green plus bonds and how we can make them attractive for investors, and at the same time delivering the social and environmental impacts.
Thank you, Felipe. And I'm keen to get, there's some fantastic questions coming on the Q&A, so I'm very keen to get to them. But before I do, Nick, can I just come back to you, because that very important point that Felipe is highlighting of, you know, as the investor community can do a lot in terms of redirecting capital, but it needs the very clear commitment and signals from public policymakers, whether that's national governments or international initiatives. And really, I wanted to ask you I mean, obviously, it feels incredibly important that from COP26, we get the absolute cast out iron commitments to the necessary action on climate change, on biodiversity. But how do you see, where does public policy need to go, partly, you know, within COP26 to commit to those broader just transition goals and outcomes that we believe are so incredibly important?
Yeah, I think Davide outlined it very well, in fact, and talked about the sort of cascade from EU Green Deal, the Italian Green Deal, through to the Treasury, and then the sovereign bond as the instrument. And that's why I think sovereign bonds are such a powerful instrument, because obviously they connect public finance for public policy goals, green, social, economic growth, with capital markets and investors. And that's why I think they're a very profound tool for driving us forward out of COVID. I mean, clearly, what we hope is that the COP26 happening in 30 days' time, which is obviously being co-hosted by the UK and Italy, will deliver those more ambitious climate plans across the world. We're seeing good progress there, but obviously not enough yet. And a key element on that will be, in a sense, the how that is going to be delivered in a economic strategy sense and just transition. We're very much hoping that there will be a ministerial statement specifically on the just transition. And again, I think that will therefore give a further signal, let's say from the COP level, to leading nations such as Italy, the European Union, the UK, and developing countries to start including explicitly just transition in their financing. And if I may just follow on the sort of developing country dimension, I mean, certainly the investors I've spoken to would say that actually taking a sustainable development goals approach, as Italy has done, connecting the environmental and social, will actually really strengthen, in a sense, the risk, the perceptions of risk and the quality of issuance, and improve, therefore, potentially the cost of capital for those issuers. So I think there is some really strong strategic opportunities for developing countries to actually get lower costs of capital by increasing that broader sort of integrity of their issuance by taking that SDG framework, which Davide had outlined earlier.
Thank you, Nick. And Arunma, just before we turn to audience questions, can I ask you a question with your World Bank hat on, which is really about, okay, we talked about national policymakers, but what is the role of the multilateral development banks and the development finance institutions? So the World Banks of this world, the multilateral organizations, how do they need to work? Do they need to work better with private sector, with institutional capital, to deliver the just transition, to deliver Green Plus? What needs to change at the multilateral development bank side of things?
You're talking to an evangelist for multilateral development banks. So I think, and I've said this several times, the role of multilateral development banks has always been to focus on issues around sustainability. And I liked what both Nick and Filippo, the points made around the value of a holistic approach, and Davide. And if you look at the mandates of multilateral organizations like the World Bank, their work is to catalyze capital. We've seen that public sector is unable to address all of the challenges, even in developed advanced nations, and therefore catalyzing capital, sharing knowledge about the countries and entities that they themselves invest in. So providing that risk capital, being there first, being the honest broker between entities, between governments in those countries and the rest of society, providing advice on policy, regulatory support, and the operating environment. And you've seen that play out in how the green finance has evolved. Multilateral agencies, and particularly the World Bank, when I was there, the Treasury team worked on developing a framework for issuance for countries that range from Indonesia to Fiji to Nigeria, all with different kinds of issues. So one of the things that's been interesting is for countries where there's a Muslim population, the connection between green sustainability, sustainable finance, and Islamic finance. It's also, for me, what Nick shared about, that when people have more familiarity with the risk that whether a country or a business in the developing world faces, it can have a huge impact in terms of the cost of capital. And so what we've seen, when I was at the World Bank, we helped Seychelles with the Blue Bond. We've seen people being interested in understanding better how they can do good and do well at the same time. So my view is that multilateral agencies, and particularly development banks, are at the center of these kinds of transactions. One of my favorite transactions is a PPP that was done in the health sector in Turkey. That PPP is like a 20 billion euro transaction that had various elements. You had the World Bank providing policy support. You had EBRD, on the other hand, providing a guarantee for a green bond. So one of the things that this has also inspired is a lot of innovation. And as I said, because of the comfort that people feel about a support from a multilateral development bank, they can even do more in terms of the risk capital that they can deploy. And of course, they're owned by governments from around the world. And so that signaling also helps in governments feeling that they can do more in those countries. And of course, the African Development Bank has a private sector arm, the World Bank has a private sector arm, the IFC, and all of them are deploying capital directly to the private sector and signaling where it is that people can go. And investors tend to feel more comfortable when there's a multilateral agency in a particular deal. So that's what I would share in response to your question.
And that incredibly important role of those different financial actors acting together to lower risk or perception of risk is incredibly, it's that you've mentioned some of those public-private partnerships where it has been very effective, but I think we feel there's real momentum behind this, and it's part of the focus of the work of the Impact Task Force that we're both involved in, is really thinking through how multilateral development banks and private sector institutional investors can work most effectively together, particularly around risk appetite challenges, because that's one of the has been one of the fundamental barriers to more private sector capital operating in emerging markets. We've got some fantastic questions from the audience, and I want to come to them, but I think they build on the discussion we've been having as a group. And I think Davide, that the first question in our Q&A is one that I think is particularly relevant. You spoke about it in your initial answer, but I think I'll go to you first and then see if other panelists have views, which is from Trina Schmidt, who works at the SDG Lab in the UN in Geneva. And she says, I would be interested to learn more about how you align the green bonds, climate bonds to the SDGs, ensuring a holistic approach to sustainable development as defined by the 2030 agenda. And obviously, Davide, you have real life hands-on experience of how you worked through that process. So perhaps I'll come to you first with that question and then see if other panelists have views. Davide, over to you.
Thank you. It's quite a tough question. So I have to say, when we decided to go through this initiative, of course, the most relevant and I would say intense kind of job was to go through our budget almost line by line, to understand exactly what were and what still are the future expected green expenditures, and trying to understand how much they aligned with the principles that we adopted for our green bonds so far, which are the ICMA principles. And you know very well that the ICMA principles give several standards. So we basically try to figure out each line of our budget, how it was aligned with that. And as you know, then we had also a second party opinion providers regarding our framework that somehow certified the quality of our selection process on those 6 areas that I mentioned before, when it goes to the incentives that are given to households to improve the efficiency of the buildings, to incentives for developing renewable energies, all the expenditures that are in the public sector related to transportation, trying to move, much more possible transportation from roads to railways, and also to move local public transportation with traditional fuels into electric vehicles. And then when it comes to protection of biodiversity, and then when it comes to circular economy, and then our research. So it's quite a massive activity in trying to understand whether each of these budget lines were, green compatible according to ICMA principle, and then to which of this category they could belong to. And then we have these, as I said, first selection of expenditures. We found, for example, that over the period of 2018 to 2021, we had a portfolio of expenditures of around 35 billion euros. And so this activity was somehow carried out together with this external reviewer. So that's the kind of process that we put in place in order to then be sure that these expenditures were, aligned to reach what you mentioned, the SDG goals and the EU taxonomy goals. I want to go, however, a little bit back on the point of how to introduce social issues when it comes to this selection of green eligible expenditure. Well, to be honest, it was not us to make this kind of analysis, but the second party opinion provider. They came to us and say, we want to know, regarding these expenditures that you have selected, what are the social safeguards that are in place in your countries? So when it comes to public contracts, how human rights are fulfilled, how workers' rights are fulfilled, and what is the involvement, for example, of local communities when it comes to the decision of a public work and so on. And so they went through a very thorough analysis of our legislation, not easy also from that point of view, and they decided that the social risk relating to our green eligible expenditures were low, so our adherence also to the social risk were pretty robust. But nonetheless, when we carried out this exercise, we realized that we don't have, an organic mapping of these social elements regarding all our public expenditures. So we need to do more. We have laws in place, but for example, we don't have a clear picture regarding the enforcement of these laws in all these areas. So that it's extremely important. So I think this is much thing that we need to go through now if we want to have even a better appraisal of the social safeguards regarding regarding the selection of our green eligible expenditures. But my thoughts are that if we move even more towards being compliant with EU taxonomy, this will be more and more relevant, because in the EU taxonomy we will have technical screening criteria, which mostly are quantitative screening criteria to decide whether expenditure is green or not. But of course, we don't have technical screening criteria on the social issue. I know this is a discussion now that it's at EU level regarding the possibility of introducing a social taxonomy. We are involved in this discussion, but we are aware of all the difficulties of, quantify and create a criteria when it comes to workers' rights or involvement of social community and so on. Then it's much more difficult to have, a quantitative criteria, quantitative parameters, capex, or to be set in that respect. So, but I think this will be an very interesting discussions over the next months. And once we will have, as it probably is, the social taxonomy, then it will be interesting to understand how the social one will be integrated with the environmental one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I say something? Because I do think that anchoring the transactions on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is extremely powerful. That's what we've seen, or that's what the World Bank saw in its experience. So we transitioned from just doing green bonds to doing sustainable development bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. And what I find when we advised countries, what we said, or investors or issuers, is to start with that framework. It's simple. It can focus on the things that you feel that you have projects that are related to. And I'd like to just share an example. So the Folksam Group is an insurance company in Sweden. They invested, we did a transaction with them at the time as a World Bank for $350 million. And they looked at the Sustainable Development Goals and they chose 4 goals. They chose health and well-being, gender equality, consumption and production, and climate action, and focused on those. So even on the investor side, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are providing guidance as a starting point as you develop your framework and your taxonomy? Thank you.
Filippo, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I wanted to jump in on this question because I'm a huge fan of Sdg Impact Standards that have been developed by UNDP. And I think those standards can help very much issuers, bond issuers. Some guidelines have been developed, and they are focusing on the strategy of the bond issuer, but also on other aspects that make more strategic the instrument, the financial instrument itself, as it looks at the governance, the transparency, the management processes. So I would recommend anybody who's interested in the topic reading these guidelines that has the aim to strengthen the link between bonds and SDGs achievement.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think these are all, we haven't really this issue that Davide started off with, really around the need for transparency and accountability, and what a high degree of work that requires from an issuer's point of view. But I also think we need to address, and one of our audience members has specifically raised the question, the challenge of how can we be sure that the proceeds of this kind of financing are being spent on the things that investors believe they are being spent on? And the audience member says the danger of greenwashing has been mentioned a few times, but how do you concretely ensure that the use of proceeds of green bonds is really going to 100% green projects? Can governments and other issuers be held accountable? And if so, how and by whom? And I mean, this issue of transparency and accountability is critical to the work we're doing in the Impact Task Force. I think it's going to be critical to the development and to maximizing the potential of this market. So I think it's a very important question to have raised. Who would like to come in on this first?
I can.
Arunma. And then I'll come.
Okay. I guess it's a popular question. So I have 2 points to make. One, and I actually have a pitch. I'm hoping that one day that all bonds will be the same as the rigorous process of green bonds. And so if we ask that question as to how can we do better, I'm asking, why aren't conventional bonds doing what green bonds are doing? I think there's rigor in the process, which gives comfort to an investor. And I both have experience as an investor, as an issuer when you work in multilateral development bank treasuries. The second point is just that process of you do screening, you do monitoring through your periodic impact reports. You have a second party opinion. In the case of the UK, which you and Nick were very much involved in, the VE provided that second party opinion. There's a third party verification. It's very much similar to the way that projects are reviewed systematically and consistently with respect to multilateral development banks. But I just want to add a point, Sarah, which is that yes, there are dangers of greenwashing, but the global standards, moving towards clarity in terms of what things mean will help us in that regard. But investors are also doing the analysis. Investors are not just sitting back. And so people are rewarded for being, for the fact that what they say is actually what they're doing. That's what the investor's role is. The investor is not just sitting back and bonds are thrown at them. They're making choices as to what they focus on. And they're making choices about how much they will pay. And I do think that the greenium that the UK bond end was actually as a result of people feeling that, yes, they're going to be zero emission buses, there's going to be leveling up, there's going to be renewable. So investors are not stupid. They're really looking at the fact that what you say is actually what you're doing. Thank you.
But I do think that they need the global developments to support that that analysis and that engagement. work, you know, that's being done at the moment at the IFRS Foundation around setting up an international sustainability standards board is going to help. But the more we can have converged, transparent global standards, the easier that accountability and transparency challenge is going to be, isn't it? Nick, let me turn to you. You're mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the steps that have now been set out in the ICMA frameworks and the Green Bond Standard at the EU level are very, very clear. Be clear about the framework, the second party, the reporting, the verification. And I think a number of countries have also taken the opportunity, as the UK has done, to have a stakeholder forum, which also is I think, quite helpful behind closed doors to think about specifics and ambition and so on. It's a sort of a group of sort of friendly experts who can actually help support the government and the issuer and the DMO. So I think these are all important. Maybe if I could take the issue from the other end of the telescope. I think we have about 1.5 trillion in outstanding green and sustainability bonds. So 1.5% of the 100 trillion, which Arunma was talking about earlier. I'm more worried about vanilla washing. And in a sense, I'm more worried about the vanilla bonds, particularly that perhaps aren't talking about their environmental, social credentials. So I think as we move towards this becoming a more normal structure, I think in the corporate space, we obviously seeing greater reporting, but yes, we do need to focus on the integrity of the badged green bonds, and those can be a real driver or vanguard, but also we need to maybe be focusing on some of those issuances from sectors which do have particularly high environmental impacts, perhaps fossil fuels, where they're not disclosing, and perhaps put more attention on the social environmental impacts there as well.
I think that goes back also to Filippo's very first point that he made in his first answer, which is around consideration of impact. Is that I would say with Arunma and with Nick that we need to move to a world where all investments are accounting for their impact as well as the risk and return around that they're delivering. And that's, you know, you're talking about the whole the vanilla space becoming impactful as well. Davide, let me turn to you.
It's me, sorry, yeah.
Yes.
No, I just want to mirror a couple of points that were raised by Arunma, by saying that it is true that investors are not sitting on their chairs and just observing what we're doing. I mean, I mean, if I tell you our experience, before when we announced our issuance and when we get out with the framework and then with the bond, we were really, you know, inundated by questions, investors, very, very analytic question, very in-depth questions that proved how they went through our documentation and even I think also through our budget. Secondly, we cannot also forget about some of these private associations that do a lot of analytic work, and then they decide, for example, whether to include these bonds in some of the main and most relevant indexes. And these indexes gets the reputation based on the quality of the work that this association do. I'm referring, I want to do any kind of advertisement here, but the CBI or MSI, they do a lot of analysis. And so before a bond is there, there's a lot of work that has been done in terms of, you know, doing a screening, very thorough screening of what we're doing. Finally, let me tell you that, and this is the second point I want to mirror Arunma, the role of these external verifiers, that it's extremely important because they are not only concerned the framework, but then, for example, just a few weeks ago, we came out with an analytic table regarding these 8.5 billion euros that we issued in March. What are the specific expenditures that will be covered with that in that table? And then next year, we will publish our report informing investors exactly regarding the development of the situation regarding these expenditures, how much has been realized, how much is not realized, and for what reason, and start also thinking about impact of these expenditures. And these reports will be under, again, the analysis of these external verifiers, which, by the way, according, for example, to the EU proposal of EU Green Bond Standards, these verifiers will be under the supervision of the European and national competent authorities and the ESMA. So again, this, brings to a conclusion that also at European level, they're building a very, very resilient infrastructure regarding this green bond issuance in order to, I don't want to say cancel completely, but limit as much as possible the risk of greenwashing. Also because these European authorities will also have the power actually to go and verify the issuer documentation. So not only through these external verifiers, but also themselves, they will retain some power to do this kind of control. So I think all these will bring to a situation where greenwashing regarding green bonds will be more and more difficult.
Thank you, Davide. And I think as a former journalist, I also think the media has a role to play. We need investors, issuers, verifiers, national governments, regulators, the media. There is on all of us a responsibility for that accountability, and make sure that that accountability is properly reported on and communicated. We've only got a few minutes left, and I did just want to get one quick last round of questions in before the end. We've obviously got this big event in November with COP26 and the run-up events in Italy and the UK, of which this discussion is a part. I know that we all have high expectations for COP. We need to have high expectations for COP. I'd really like to ask on the green plus bonds in particular, what each of your messages would be to sovereign and corporate bond issuers looking at the potential for green plus bonds ahead of COP. And I'll probably just go alphabetically with that. So Arunma, can I start with you?
I will say that if you're not on the bandwagon of leveraging green and green plus bonds, you need to get yourself organized. I'm praying that my desire that green bonds, that what are the unique characteristics of green bonds becomes what conventional bonds have to do. I'm praying that that happens. Last year, the Pension and Investments Journal noted that ESG-driven assets had basically risen 3 times to $40.5 billion. So if you're looking to finance as a sovereign, as a corporate, I think that you've got a real opportunity to get yourself organized and prepare for this. It's our new world. So thank you.
Thank you, Arunma. Davide, your quick message to issuers on green plus bonds ahead of COP.
I have to say that I think this idea of going through these kind of specialized issuance, I call it this way, whether sustainable or green, is a road that need to be taken in order to create the right incentives to move into sustainability. So I really like these economic and financial incentives for issuer to put in place sustainable policies, whether they're as a corporate or a government, knowing they have a source of funding specialized on that. And this seems to be a tremendously powerful tool to incentivize, to change their policies and to look more and more deeply into sustainability with respect to what has happened so far, or just with respect to, for example, international agreements and so on. So I think that's the future, and we have to work in order to have these frameworks to work better and better, and to be reliable more and more. But that's the road to go through.
Thank you, Filippo.
Well, I would recommend not only issuers and investors, but all the stakeholders to to collaborate, to establish partnerships, because I think it's the entire impact ecosystem that will facilitate the development of these instruments. And I believe that together we can not only find, but also build opportunities for investing on the environment with the social co-benefits. So, I mean, the buzzword would be collaboration between stakeholders.
Thank you, Filippo. Nick?
Yeah, I think in many ways we need to think sort of the day after COP and the years after COP. This is the decade, this decade where we need to expand investment just in net zero by 5 times in the European Union, by 7 times a year in emerging economies. So the shape of the curve is not going to be smooth. It's going to be really the increasing pace. And so this is a growing market. And I think this is an instrument, the green with solid credentials, bringing in the social, is a real way for governments to actually make their policy commitments real for investors, but also, as you were saying, for policy banks like CDP in Italy, for example, the UK Infrastructure Bank, and also for corporates. So I think this is really part of the next phase of greening the financial system.
Thank you all very much indeed. I mean, I've enormously enjoyed this discussion, and I'm very grateful for the 4 of you for contributing so engagingly. I think, you know, to summarize those last messages, everyone needs to jump on the bandwagon of green and green plus financing. You're missing a trick if you're not, and that is the bottom line. I think the point that Davide made about there is a powerful incentive, and I think the examples from Italy, from the UK, has been done so far, and how the market is being pushed to develop by those sovereign issuers it provides a really powerful incentive to others to adopt this approach. I think Nick, that point that the dimension, the social dimension, makes the policy commitments real. It not just gets public backing, but it really forces governments to think through the real impact on people and communities of that environmental financing and the environmental commitments. And finally, I have to finish with Filippo's point, which is collaboration is everything. We have to collaborate, we have to establish partnerships, and that is the way that we will deliver the goals that we're all working towards. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to our audience. Really grateful for your participation, and let's keep on discussing this important subject. Thank you and goodbye.